Imagine standing in the middle of the desert, not knowing that decisions made thousands of miles away would shape your future, your freedom, and your history. What if I told you that the modern Middle East was not only shaped by wars in the sand, but by secret meetings, oil discoveries, political fear, and powerful global ambitions? What if the borders of entire nations were drawn by strangers who had never walked the land? Today's story is about power, betrayal, revolution, oil, war, and the hidden truth behind how the Middle East was shaped. Because the question is not just what happened. The real question is, how did it happen? Stay with me. The truth is deeper than you think. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. History rarely announces itself with thunder. More often, it moves quietly through secret meetings. Ink on fragile papers, whispered promises and decisions made in rooms far away from the people whose lives will be forever changed. To understand how the modern Middle East was shaped, we must begin not with armies, but with a map and with power. Because maps in the hands of empires are not just drawings of land, and not just drawings of land. They are declarations of control. And in the 20th century, the United States stepped into a region already scarred by colonial ambition, and slowly, steadily reshaped its destiny. The vacuum of empire at the dawn of the 1900s, the Middle East was largely ruled by the Ottoman Empire, a vast, aging state that stretched across continents. For centuries, the Ottomans governed a mosaic of peoples: Arabs, Kurds, Turks, Persians, Armenians, Christians, Muslims, and Jews. But empires aged the way mountains erode, slowly, then suddenly. When World War I erupted in 1914, the Ottoman Empire aligned with Germany. 4 years later, it collapsed, and in its ruins lay the future of the Middle East. 4 years later, collapsed, and in its ruins lay the future of the Middle East. European powers rushed in first. Britain and France carved up the region through the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, drawing borders that ignored tribes, languages, and centuries of local history. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. New countries born not from the will of their people, but from the calculations of foreign diplomats. Yet as the British and French Empire slowly weakened after World War II, another power began to rise. Across the Atlantic, the United States. Oil, the blood of modern power in the early 20th century, the world discovered something that would change everything. Oil. Oil-powered ships, airplanes, factories, and armies. And beneath the sands of the Middle East lay the largest reserves on Earth. American leaders understood this clearly. In 1945, near the end of World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt met with Saudi ruler King Abdulaziz ibn Saud aboard the USS Quincy in the Suez Canal. It was a quiet meeting, no headlines, no grand speeches, but the agreement was simple and powerful. America would guarantee Saudi security. Saudi Arabia would ensure access to oil. From that moment on, the relationship between the United States and the Middle East would revolve around a single unspoken reality. Energy was power, and whoever controlled oil shaped the world. The coup that changed everything, but influence is rarely built through diplomacy alone. Sometimes it arrives in the shadows. In 1953, the elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mosaddegh, made a bold decision. He nationalized Iran's oil industry, taking control away from Western companies that had dominated it for decades. For many Iranians, it was an act of sovereignty. For Washington and London, it was a threat. The Cold War had begun, and American leaders feared that instability in Iran might push the country toward the Soviet Union. So the United States, through the Central Intelligence Agency, orchestrated 1953 Iranian coup d'etat. Mosaddegh was removed from power. And the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was restored to the throne with strong American backing. For the next quarter century, Iran would remain one of Washington's closest allies in the region. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered. And history has a way of remembering. The birth of an unbreakable alliance in 1948, another event transformed the Middle East forever. The creation of the State of Israel. For Jews around the world, many of whom had survived the horrors of the Holocaust, it was a long-awaited homeland. But for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, it meant displacement and loss. The conflict that followed would become one of the most enduring and painful struggles in modern history. Over time, the United States became Israel's strongest ally, providing military support, economic aid, and diplomatic protection on the world stage. For American leaders, Israel represented a democratic partner in a volatile region. For many in the Arab world, it symbolized Western interference and injustice. Two narratives: two histories, and a conflict that still echoes today. Wars and the expanding American presence. By the late 20th century, the United States had become deeply entangled in the politics of the Middle East. American military bases appeared across the region. Alliances formed with governments in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, and the Gulf states. And when conflict erupted, American power often followed. In 1990, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, threatening global oil supplies. The response was swift. A U.S. Daesh-led coalition launched Operation Desert Storm, pushing Iraqi forces out of Kuwait in a matter of weeks. For many Americans, it was proof of their country's global leadership. For many in the Middle East, it was another reminder that foreign powers could shape the region's destiny through force. The shock of a new century then came a day that changed everything. On September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks carried out by al-Qaeda killed nearly 3,000 people in the United States. The attacks led Washington into its longest and most controversial wars, first in Afghanistan, then in 2003 in Iraq, where the U.S. government argued that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. Those weapons were never found, but the invasion toppled Iraq's government and unleashed years of violence and instability that reshaped the entire region. What followed was not a clean victory, but a long, painful struggle whose consequences are still unfolding. A legacy written in sand. So did the United States steal the Middle East? History is rarely that simple. The region's story is not one of a single thief or a single victim. It is a tapestry of ambitions, American, European, regional, and local. Empires seeking influence, leaders seeking survival, nations seeking power, and ordinary people seeking dignity in a landscape, often shaped by forces far beyond their control. Yet one truth remains difficult to ignore. For more than 70 years, American decisions, diplomatic, economic, and military, have profoundly shaped the Middle East. Its borders, its governments, its conflicts, and its future. The unfinished story history is not a closed book. It is a conversation between the past and the present. The Middle East today is not merely the result of ancient rivalries or religious divisions. It is also the product of 20th century choices made in Washington, London, Moscow, Tehran, Riyadh, and countless other capitals. Choices about oil, choices about power, choices about who would rule and who would not. And as the world moves deeper into the 21st century, the region remains one of the most important and most fragile places on Earth. Its people continue to live with the consequences of decisions made decades ago. Decisions drawn on maps, decisions signed in secret, decisions that shaped a region and changed the course of history. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join the space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. In the early years of the 20th century, the lands we now call the Middle East were not divided into the familiar borders of Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. Instead, they formed part of a vast and aging empire that had ruled the region for centuries, the Ottoman Empire. From the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Anatolia, from the holy cities of Jerusalem and Mecca to the ancient streets of Baghdad and Damascus, the Ottomans governed a diverse mosaic of languages, religions, and cultures. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Kurds, Arabs, Turks, and Armenians lived under a single imperial system that, while imperfect, allowed a complex balance of local autonomy and centralized authority. For hundreds of years, the empire acted as the political framework that held the region together, but by the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was weakening. European observers had already begun calling it the sick man of Europe. Internal corruption, economic strain, nationalist movements, and the growing technological and military strength of European powers slowly eroded Ottoman authority. Railroads, telegraphs, and modern armies were transforming the balance of power across the world, and the Ottoman state struggled to keep pace. While the empire attempted reforms to modernize its institutions, the forces pulling it apart were stronger than the reforms trying to hold it together. When the First World War erupted in 1914, the Ottoman leadership made a fateful decision. It aligned itself with Germany and the Central Powers against Britain, France, and their allies. What followed was a brutal conflict that stretched across continents. But in the deserts and cities of the Middle East, it also became a struggle for the future of the region itself. British strategists recognized that weakening Ottoman control could open the door to reshaping the entire Middle Eastern landscape. To achieve this, they began encouraging Arab leaders to revolt against Ottoman rule, promising independence and the possibility of a unified Arab state once the war was over. Among those who took up the cause was Hussein bin Ali, the powerful Arab leader who ruled the holy city of Mecca. In through a series of letters exchanged with the British High Commissioner in Egypt. Henry McMahon, the British government appeared to promise Arab independence in much of the territory controlled by the Ottomans. These letters, known as the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, ignited hope among many Arab leaders that the collapse of the Ottoman Empire might give birth to a new political order led by the region's own people. The revolt that followed, often called the Arab Revolt, 1916 and 1918, saw Arab fighters join forces with British officers in a campaign against Ottoman rule. One of the most famous figures associated with this effort was T.E. Lawrence, whose daring desert campaigns helped sabotage Ottoman railways and weaken imperial supply lines. The revolt captured the imagination of many across the region, symbolizing the possibility of liberation from centuries of imperial rule. Yet while Arab leaders believed they were fighting for independence, powerful decisions were already being made behind closed doors in Europe. In 1916, Britain and France secretly negotiated a plan to divide the Ottoman territory between them once the war ended. This agreement, known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, was named after the two diplomats who helped craft it, Mark Sykes and Francois-Georges Picot. With little knowledge of the region's cultural, tribal, and religious complexities, they drew lines across maps outlining zones of influence that would eventually become the borders of new nations. Under this agreement, France would gain control or influence over areas that later became Syria and Lebanon, while Britain would dominate territories that would become Iraq and Jordan. Palestine was designated for international administration, reflecting its religious significance to multiple faiths. These decisions were not shaped by the aspirations of the people living there, but by strategic calculations in European capitals. When the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed, at the end of the war in 1918, the promises of independence that many Arab leaders believed in began to fade. Instead of a unified Arab kingdom, the victorious powers implemented a system known as the Mandate System under the League of Nations. Officially, these mandates were supposed to guide territories toward eventual independence. In practice, they functioned much like colonial rule under a different name. Britain took control of the territories that would become Iraq and Jordan, while France established authority over Syria and Lebanon. The borders of these new political entities were often drawn with straight lines across deserts and mountains, ignoring tribal networks, ethnic communities, and historical relationships that had shaped the region for generations. In Iraq, the British assembled three former Ottoman provinces, Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, into a single state, combining Sunni Arabs, Shiite Arabs, and Kurds within one political framework. In Syria, French authorities divided the region into several smaller administrative units in an effort to weaken nationalist movements. Lebanon was separated from Syria and given its own political structure, partly to protect the region's Christian communities and maintain French influence. For many people across the Middle East, these developments felt like a betrayal. The promises of independence made during the war seemed to vanish as European powers tightened their grip on the region. Arab leaders who had fought alongside the Allies found themselves marginalized or forced to negotiate within systems designed by foreign administrators. At the same time, the seeds of future conflict were quietly planted. Borders that had been drawn for strategic convenience created states with deep internal divisions. Communities that had once lived within flexible imperial systems were now confined within rigid national boundaries. The political authority often rested with leaders supported by external powers rather than by broad local consensus. In Palestine, tensions were also beginning to rise following the Balfour Declaration of 1917. In which Britain expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people. This declaration, issued by Arthur Balfour, introduced another layer of complexity to a region already undergoing rapid transformation. Across the Middle East, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire did not simply end an old political order. It replaced it with a new system built largely by outside powers, one that redefined borders, governments, and alliances in ways that would shape the region for generations. The decisions made during and immediately after the First World War became the foundation of the modern Middle East, embedding tensions in the modern Middle East, embedding tensions and rivalries into the very structure of the states that emerged from the empire's ruins. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join the space of presence and share yo go. Devotes, we know they exist. Deepest now, in the comments below. In the early decades of the 20th century, the deserts of the Middle East seemed empty to many outside observers. Endless sands stretched beyond the horizon, broken only by scattered oases, ancient trade routes, and small communities that had lived there for generations. But beneath those silent landscapes lay a resource that would transform the global balance of power: oil. What had once been remote and overlooked territory would soon become one of the most strategically important regions on Earth. At the turn of the century, the world was undergoing an industrial revolution powered by coal. Yet technology was changing rapidly. Modern navies, automobiles, airplanes, and factories required a new kind of fuel. Oil, it burned cleaner, produced more energy, and could move machines faster and farther than anything before it. The great powers of the world began searching urgently for reliable oil supplies, realizing that whoever controlled this resource would hold enormous influence over the future. The first major discovery in the Middle East came in 1908 when British-backed prospectors struck oil in southwestern Iran. The find transformed the region overnight. Soon after, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was established to develop these reserves. This company would later evolve into the global energy giant BP. For the British government, access to this oil was not merely economic, it was a matter of national security. The British Navy, once powered by coal, was converting to oil under the direction of leaders such as Winston Churchill, who believed oil would give Britain a decisive advantage in future wars. As the First World War ended and the Ottoman Empire collapsed, European powers expanded their influence across the Middle East, partly to secure access to these emerging energy resources. Iraq, in particular, attracted attention because of its potential oil fields near Mosul and Kirkuk. British companies quickly moved to establish control over exploration and production there, recognizing that the region might contain vast reserves.
But as the 20th century progressed, we know they exist. But as the 20th century progressed, the center of global power began shifting across the Atlantic. The United States emerged from the Second World War not only victorious, but economically.
American industry was booming, its factories producing goods for a rapidly expanding consumer economy. Cars filled highways, airplanes crossed oceans, and suburbs spread across the landscape. All of this required energy, an immense and growing supply of oil. At first, much of America's oil came from its own fields in places like Texas and California. But American leaders understood that domestic reserves would not last forever. Securing long-term access to foreign oil, especially in the Middle East, became an essential priority. One of the most significant developments occurred in Saudi Arabia. In the 1930s, American geologists began exploring the kingdom's deserts in search of oil. Their work was carried out by a company known as the Standard Oil of California. After years of difficult exploration in harsh conditions, they made a breakthrough in 1938 when a well near the town of Dhafran struck oil in massive quantities. The discovery marked the beginning of one of the most important partnerships in modern history. American companies soon formed a consortium that eventually became the Saudi Aramco, responsible for developing Saudi Arabia's oil industry. The scale of the reserves was staggering. Vast underground reservoirs promised to supply energy for decades, perhaps even centuries. As the world emerged from World War II, the United States moved quickly to secure a strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia's ruler, King Abdulaziz ibn Saud. In February 19th, 1945, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt met the Saudi king aboard the American warship USS Quincy in the Suez Canal. It was an unusual meeting, two leaders from vastly different cultures sitting together in the aftermath of a global war, but the understanding they reached would shape international politics for generations. The arrangement was straightforward but powerful. The United States would provide security and political support for Saudi Arabia, helping protect the kingdom from external threats. In return, Saudi Arabia would maintain a stable supply of oil to the United States and its allies. This informal agreement laid the foundation for a partnership that still defines the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. American engineers, workers, and investment soon poured into Saudi Arabia. Entire cities were built to support the growing oil industry. Pipelines stretched across deserts, connecting wells to refineries and ports. Tankers carried Saudi crude across oceans to fuel factories, cars, and power plants in Europe, Asia, and North America. As oil production expanded, so did the strategic importance of the Middle East. American policymakers increasingly viewed the region through the lens of energy security. Stability in oil-producing countries became a major objective of U.S. foreign policy. Governments that could guarantee reliable oil supplies were often supported politically, economically, and sometimes militarily. During the Cold War, this strategy became even more urgent. The United States feared that instability in the Middle East might allow the Soviet Union to gain influence over the region's oil reserves. If the Soviet bloc gained control over these resources, it could shift the balance of global power dramatically. American leaders therefore worked to maintain strong relationships with governments across the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia, IFRS, meeting gas relations, so for Iran and Kuwait. At the same time, oil wealth began transforming the societies of the region itself. Countries that had once been relatively poor desert kingdoms suddenly found themselves sitting on the extraordinary financial resources. Modern infrastructure, highways, airports, hospitals, and universities began appearing across the Gulf states, funded by the revenue generated from oil exports, yet this transformation also created new complexities. The global economy became increasingly dependent on Middle Eastern oil, giving the region enormous influence over international markets. This reality became dramatically clear during the 1973 oil crisis. In response to Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, Arab oil-producing nations imposed an embargo on exports to the United States and several European countries. Almost overnight, fuel prices soared. Long lines formed at gas stations across America. The crisis revealed just how deeply the global economy depended on Middle Eastern energy supplies. It also reinforced the strategic importance of maintaining strong ties with the region's oil-producing states. From that moment forward, American involvement in the Middle East became inseparable from the issue of energy. Oil was no longer simply a commodity. It was a cornerstone of geopolitical power. Military bases, diplomatic alliances, and economic agreements were all shaped by the need to ensure that the flow of oil continued uninterrupted. In the decades that followed, the United States expanded its presence across the Persian Gulf, developing security partnerships with countries such as Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar.
American naval fleets patrolled the waters of the Persian Gulf, safeguarding shipping lanes through which millions of barrels of oil traveled each day. The deserts that once seemed distant and empty had become the center of a vast global network
of energy and power, where decisions made in Washington, Riyadh, and other capitals could ripple across the entire world economy. Sensuals, we have Washington. Riyadh, where the strategic partnership between the United States and Saudi Arabia continued to deepen as oil revenues reshaped societies and reinforced the geopolitical importance of the Middle East. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. The year 1953 stands as one of the most controversial turning points in modern Middle Eastern history, a moment when global politics, Cold War fears, economic interests, and national sovereignty collided in ways that would echo for decades. In the heart of Iran, a struggle was unfolding that was not only about oil, but about independence, democracy, and the balance of power between nations. At the center of this struggle was Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh, a man who had risen to power through democratic processes and widespread popular support. Mosaddegh was not a revolutionary in the violent sense, but rather a nationalist leader who believed that Iran's natural resources should belong to the Iranian people. For decades, Iran's oil industry had been dominated by foreign interests through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British-controlled enterprise that extracted and exported Iranian oil while providing relatively limited revenue to the Iranian state. Mossadegh's vision was simple yet deeply transformative. He sought to nationalize Iran's oil industry, placing it under Iranian control so that profits from oil production could be used to improve education, infrastructure, healthcare, and economic development within the country. In 1951, under Mossadegh's leadership, Iran formally nationalized its oil industry, challenging the long-standing dominance of Western corporations in the region. The reaction on Britain was swift and intense. The British government viewed the nationalization as a direct threat to its economic interests and global influence. British leaders argued that the move violated international business agreements and could destabilize oil markets. Diplomatic negotiations between Iran and Britain quickly deteriorated. Britain imposed economic sanctions and initiated efforts to undermine Iran's oil exports by pressuring global partners not to purchase Iranian crude. Inside Iran, the political climate became increasingly divided. Mosaddegh enjoyed strong support among many Iranians who saw him as a symbol of national dignity and independence. However, powerful opposition groups also existed within the country. Iranian monarchy, led by Shah Mohammad, Reza Pahlavi, viewed Mossadegh's growing influence with concern. Conservative political factions, segments of the military, and foreign intelligence agencies were watching the situation closely. At the global level, the world was entering the Cold War. a period defined by ideological rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. American policymakers feared that instability in Iran might create an opening for communist influence to expand in the region. The Soviet Union was geographically close to Iran's northern borders, and American strategic planners believed that losing Iran to communist alignment could threaten access to Middle Eastern oil and shift the global balance of power. Within this atmosphere of fear and geopolitical competition, the United States, through the Central Intelligence Agency, began considering covert action. American and British intelligence services developed a plan to remove Mosaddegh from power, believing that his removal would stabilize Iran politically and protect Western strategic interests. The operation that followed would later be known as the 1953 Iranian Sea. Out d'etat, also called Operation Ajax. The coup was not executed through open military invasion, but through a combination of psychological operations, political manipulation, and support for internal opposition groups. Intelligence agents worked to spread propaganda within Iran, encouraging unrest and weakening Mossadegh's political base. Some historical accounts describe efforts to influence Iranian military officers, religious leaders, and street protests to create the appearance of widespread opposition to the prime minister. Initially, the coup attempt faced difficulties. Mosaddegh had strong public support, and early efforts to remove him failed. For a brief moment, it appeared that the operation might collapse. However, renewed coordination between American and British intelligence networks eventually succeeded in destabilizing Mossadegh's government. In August 1953, forces loyal to the Shah, supported by elements connected to the covert operation, moved against Mossadegh's administration. The prime minister was arrested, removed from power, and later placed under house arrest. The Shah returned to greater political authority, strengthening monarchical rule in Iran. The consequences of the coup were profound and long-lasting. Many Iranians viewed the intervention as a violation of national sovereignty. Although Western governments argued that the operation was necessary to prevent communist expansion and maintain regional stability, critics argued that it undermined democratic governance in Iran. Following Mossadegh's removal, the Shah's government maintained close ties with the United States. American military aid, economic assistance, and political support flowed into Iran. The country became one of Washington's key allies in the Middle East during the Cold War. Iran's oil industry was reorganized under international agreements that allowed Western companies to continue participating in production, though with increased Iranian participating in profits. However, beneath the surface, political tensions were growing. Many Iranians believed that the coup represented foreign interference in their national affairs. Opposition movements gradually gained strength, particularly among religious and nationalist groups who resented the Shah's authoritarian policies and his close relationship with Western governments. These tensions eventually contributed to one of the most significant political revolutions of the 20th century. In 1979, widespread protests, political unrest, and revolutionary movements led to the overthrow of the Shah during the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The revolution transformed Iran's political system into an Islamic republic under the leadership of religious authorities. The events of 1953, therefore, became more than a single intelligence operation. They became a symbol of unresolved historical memory. For many people in Iran and across parts of the Middle East, the coup represented a turning point where foreign intervention altered the natural trajectory of political development. In Washington and London, the operation was often viewed through the lens of Cold War strategy. Policymakers believed they were acting to protect global stability during a period of intense ideological confrontation. The debate over the coup continues among historians, political scientists, and policymakers, reflecting broader questions about the ethics of intervention, national sovereignty, and strategic necessity. The story of 1953 is also a reminder that history is rarely shaped by one nation alone. The events in Iran were influenced by British imperial decline, American Cold War anxieties, Iranian domestic politics, and global economic interests centered on oil. The coup became part of a larger narrative in which Middle Eastern politics were deeply connected to international power struggles. Decades later, the legacy of Mosaddegh remains complex. In Iran, many remember him as a symbol of national independence and democratic aspiration. In Western historical discussions, interpretations vary widely, with some viewing the operation as a strategic necessity and others viewing it as a mistake that damaged long-term regional stability. The 1953 coup did not simply remove a leader from power. It reshaped trust between nations. It influenced future diplomatic relationships, shaped revolutionary sentiment, and became part of the historical memory that continues to influence Middle Eastern politics in the modern era. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 stands as one of the most emotionally charged and politically complex events in modern history. It was not simply the birth of a new nation, but the culmination of decades of political movements, global war, religious longing, and regional tension. For Jewish communities around the world, the establishment of Israel represented a historic homeland after centuries of displacement, persecution, and suffering, particularly following the horrors of the Holocaust during World War II. Millions of Jewish people had faced systematic extermination under Nazi Germany, an atrocity that reshaped global moral consciousness and influenced international support for a Jewish state. The intellectual and political foundation of the Zionist movement had been developing long before 1948. Leaders such as Theodor Herzl advocated for the creation of a Jewish homeland in response to rising anti-Semitism in Europe during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Herzl's vision was rooted in the belief that Jewish people needed a sovereign state where they could live safely and freely. Over time, Zionist migration to Palestine increased, especially during periods of European instability. British influence played a significant role in shaping the region's future during the early 20th century. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, issued by British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, expressed British support for establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while also stating that the rights of existing non-Jewish communities should not be harmed. However, the declaration itself became a source of long-term political disagreement because different groups interpreted its meaning in fundamentally different ways. After World War I, Palestine came under British administration through the mandate system established by the League of Nations. During this period, both Jewish and Arab populations lived in the territory, but tensions gradually increased as Jewish immigration rose, particularly during the 1930s and 1940s. Many Jewish immigrants arrived, fleeing persecution in Europe, while many Arab residents feared displacement and loss of land. The end of World War II created new global pressures to resolve the Palestinian question. Britain found itself unable to maintain political stability in the region and referred the issue to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition plan that would divide Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. Jewish leaders accepted the plan, seeing it as international recognition of their national aspirations. Arab leaders rejected the proposal, arguing that it violated the demographic and historical continuity of the region. In 1948, Jewish leaders declared the independence of Israel. The announcement was immediately followed by military conflict as neighboring Arab states opposed the creation of the new country. The conflict became known as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Countries including Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and others entered the war, believing they were defending Palestinian territory and opposing foreign political restructuring. For Palestinians, the creation of Israel became associated with displacement and loss. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs left or were forced to leave their homes during the conflict, an event remembered by Palestinians as the Nakba, meaning catastrophe. The demographic and political landscape of the region changed dramatically. Refugee populations grew across neighboring countries, creating humanitarian and political challenges that continue to influence regional stability. Stability is, from the perspective of the United States, the emergence of Israel was shaped by multiple strategic and humanitarian considerations. American leaders saw Israel as a potential democratic partner in a region dominated by monarchies and authoritarian governments. The memory of the Holocaust also generated moral and political support within American society for Jewish statehood. Over the following decades, the United States became Israel's most important international ally. And financial assistance, military cooperation, and diplomatic protection became central elements of the relationship. American foreign policy in the Middle East increasingly balanced support for Israel with maintaining strategic relationships with Arab nations. The Middle East itself became a region of competing narratives. For many Israelis, the creation of Israel represented historical justice and survival after centuries of persecution. For many Palestinians, it represented displacement and the loss of ancestral lands. These contrasting memories shaped political discourse, education, and cultural identity across generations. The conflict between Israel and neighboring Arab state continued through multiple wars and political confrontations. Major conflicts such as the Six-Day War, 1967, and the Yom Kippur War further reshaped territorial boundaries and military strategies in the region. During the Six-Day War, Israel gained control of territories including the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, intensifying international debate about occupation, security, and sovereignty. The United States often played a mediating diplomatic role, while simultaneously providing substantial military and economic assistance to Israel. Critics of American policy argued that this support influenced regional power dynamics and sometimes complicated peace negotiations. Supporters argue that the alliance promoted regional stability and democratic values. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict became one of the most studied and emotionally contested geopolitical issues in modern history. Peace initiatives were attempted multiple times, including agreements such as the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, but a permanent resolution remained elusive. The conflict's complexity stemmed from overlapping historical claims, security concerns, religious significance, and political mistrust. Religious history also played a powerful role. Jerusalem holds sacred significance for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Control and access to holy sites became both a spiritual and political question, intensifying emotional attachment to the land. The story of Israel's creation cannot be understood solely through military or political analysis. It is also a story of human migration, survival, nationalism, colonial history, and international diplomacy. The birth of Israel represented hope for many and loss for others, reflecting the broader tragedy of modern conflict, where multiple peoples hold deep historical connection to the same land. As the 20th century progressed, Israel developed advanced technology, strong military capabilities, and a diversified economy. The country became known for innovation in fields such as agriculture, cybersecurity, and medical research, often supported by cooperation with American scientific and economic institutions. At the same time, Palestinian political movements emerged, seeking recognition of statehood and territorial independence. Organizations advocating Palestinian rights gained international attention, and the question of Palestinian sovereignty became a central issue in global diplomacy. The legacy of 1948 continues to shape international relations. The creation of Israel was not merely a regional event, but a turning point in world history that influenced Cold War politics, Middle Eastern alliances, and global humanitarian discourse. The region remains a symbol of both hope and unresolved historical tension, where narratives of survival, justice, and memory intersect across generations. The late 20th and early 21st centuries marked a period of profound transformation in the Middle East, driven by warfare, political realignments, and expanding global military presence. The United States gradually became deeply involved in regional security affairs, shaping events through diplomacy, military operations, and strategic alliances. This involvement was not sudden but developed over decades, influenced by Cold War competition, energy security concerns, and the emergence of transnational militant movements. One of the most defining moments in modern Middle Eastern history occurred in 1990 when Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein made the decision to invade Kuwait. The invasion shocked the international community because Kuwait was a small but economically significant nation with vast oil reserves. Iraq justified the invasion by arguing economic disputes and historical claims, but many countries viewed the action as aggressive expansionism that threatened regional stability in global energy markets. The international response was rapid and coordinated. The United States led a multinational military coalition authorized by the United Nations to repel Iraqi forces. The military operation that followed became known as Operation Desert Storm, which was part of the broader conflict called the Gulf War, 1990-92-91. American forces, supported by allies from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, launched extensive air campaigns followed by ground operations that quickly expelled Iraqi military units from Kuwait. The Gulf War demonstrated the technological superiority of modern American military power. Precision-guided weapons, satellite surveillance, and advanced communication systems allowed coalition forces to conduct warfare with a level of coordination previously unseen in global conflicts. The war also reinforced the strategic importance of protecting oil transportation routes in the Persian Gulf, where a significant percentage of the world's petroleum exports passed through narrow maritime passages. After the war, the United States. After the war, the United States established long-term military presence in several Gulf countries to deter future regional conflicts. Bases and security partnerships developed with nations, such as Saudi Arabia, which already maintained a historic energy and political relationship with Washington. These arrangements were controversial in parts of the Arab world because some groups viewed foreign military presence as a form of political interference, The relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia had been built decades earlier through energy diplomacy and security cooperation. Saudi Arabia possessed some of the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, and stability in the kingdom was considered essential for global energy markets. The partnership involved economic, investment, military training, cooperation, and intelligence sharing designed to protect critical infrastructure. However, the American military presence in the Middle East also became a source of political resentment among certain groups. Some political movements argued that foreign troops stationed in the region undermined local sovereignty and influenced domestic political systems. These tensions contributed to the rise of radical ideologies that rejected Western political and cultural influence. The most dramatic turning point in modern U.S.-Middle East relations occurred on September 11, 2001, when members of the organization al-Qaeda carried out coordinated terrorist attacks against the United States. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives in attacks targeting the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The attacks shocked the global community and fundamentally changed American foreign policy. In response, the United States launched the war in Afghanistan, 2001, targeting militant networks believed to be responsible for the attacks. American forces sought to dismantle terrorist infrastructure and remove the Taliban government that had provided sanctuary to militant groups. 2 years later, the United States initiated the Iraq War. 2003, the American government argued that Iraqi leadership possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed a potential global security threat. The invasion resulted in the collapse of Saddam Hussein's government, but the expected discovery of such weapons never occurred. The Iraq War produced complex and long-lasting consequences. While the invasion removed an authoritarian regime, it also destabilized existing political structures within Iraq. Sectarian violence increased between different religious and ethnic communities, including Sunni and Shiite populations. The breakdown of centralized authority created conditions that allowed militant groups to gain territory and influence. Among the most significant developments that emerged from post-invasion instability was the rise of the organization known as ISIS, also called the Islamic State. The group expanded rapidly during the 2010s, capturing territory across Iraq and Syria. ISIS declared the establishment of a self-proclaimed political entity and became one of the most feared militant organizations in modern history. The United States and its international partners conducted extensive military operations to defeat ISIS through airstrikes, special operations, and support for local ground forces. These campaigns were part of a broader strategy to eliminate extremist networks while attempting to preserve regional political stability. American involvement in the Middle East also extended to diplomatic negotiations. The United States frequently attempted to mediate conflicts between Israel and Palestinian political authorities. Efforts to promote peace were influenced by security concerns, humanitarian issues, and strategic alliances. Military technology became a central component of American strategy. The development of unmanned aerial systems, cyber warfare capabilities, and advanced surveillance networks allowed the United States to conduct operations with reduced conventional troop deployment. At the same time, public opinion within the United States became divided regarding long-term military engagement in the Middle East. Some citizens supported intervention as necessary for national security, while others questioned the human and financial costs of prolonged conflicts. The modern Middle East remains a region shaped by overlapping historical forces. American influence is one part of a larger international system involving regional powers, European nations, and local governments. The consequences of 20th century wars, oil politics, revolutionary movements, and military interventions continue to influence political stability. The relationship between the United States and the Middle East cannot be defined through a single narrative. For some, American involvement represents protection, development, and strategic partnership. For others, it represents interference in the shaping of regional destiny by external power. The history of modern conflict in the Middle East reflects humanity's broader struggle with nationalism, resource competition, ideological confrontation, and the search for security in an uncertain world. The 21st century continues to witness evolving alliances, technological warfare, and diplomatic negotiations that attempt to balance regional sovereignty with global strategic interests. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. Subscribe, thanks for watching this video, and don't forget to like and